Hello everyone. Okay, so the next program in chapter 7 is larger than n. Alright, so in a program, write a function that accepts two arguments, a list and a number n. Assume that the list contains numbers. The function should display all the numbers in the list that are greater than the number n. Okay, so let's start. I want us to create our program in functions. And so let's start with the first function, which is going to be this function here. This function is going to display all the numbers in the list that are greater than the number n. So it's finding. So let's call this function. Let's define this function and call it find all greater than numbers. Greater than numbers. All right. And so we need to specify the parameters because this function is going to accept two arguments. It's going to accept first a list, and so I'm going to define a list parameter. I'm going to call it list of numbers, right? Because it's really going to be a list of numbers, just the parameter name. And the number n. So even though this program didn't say, I want to create it in such a way that we ask the user to enter that number n, so that it searches for that number in the list. So I'm going to just give it the parameter name of user number. I don't like to call it n. I don't like calling variables or naming variables n. All right, so this function here is going to return or display all the numbers in the list that are greater than n. So we're going to loop through this list of numbers and find those numbers. But I want us to create. Let's start with that. Let's loop through the list of numbers to find all the numbers greater than n, or greater than user number here in this case. So I like to use indexing to loop through list. There are other ways you can, but I like to use indexing because it gives you more control. Right. So I'm going to create a for loop. And I'm going to create a target variable. Now, I'm looping through a list of numbers, so at each point in time, we will have a current number. And I'll explain what this means in a second. I'm going to call it current number index. And I'm going to create a range here. Oops, my typing is really bad. I'm going to create a range, and the range is going to be the length of this list of numbers here. All right, so let's assume that this list will contain, let's say, 10 numbers. So in here, if the length of the list will be 10, so it's like typing 10 here in the range function. When you type in, when the value here is 10, this range function is going to create a range from 0 to 9. The 10 value is not included. It's like the ending value, like the ending limit, but it's not included in the range. The range is from 0 all the way to 9. The loop still iterate 10 times, but what this means, the range it creates, which is from 0 to 9, what it means is the first time this loop iterates, it's going to assign 0 to current number index. The second time it iterates, it's going to assign 1 to current number index. The next time it iterates, it's going to assign 2 all the way to 9. Again, 10 is not included. The loop still iterates 10 times, but it's assigning numbers to this target variable, numbers from 0 all the way through 9. And we can use this variable as basically the indexes or the indices for the elements stored in list. We know that list items have elements stored in them, and each element has an index. The first item has an index of 0, and then the last item has an index of 1 less than the length of the list. If the list has 10 items, then the first item will have an index of 0, and then the last item, which is the 10th item, will have an index of 9. Last item will have an index 1 less than the length of the list. Length of the list is 10. 1 less than the length of the list is 9. That's the index of the last item. Okay. And we can use it, like, again, the index is to access the elements in the list. So for current number index, oops, I meant to type current. So for current number index in range, not 10, but then the length of the list, because the length of the list can change. So I'm going to undo, oops. I'm going to type in the length of this list, calling the len function. Creates that range for us. So while we are looping through this list, if at any time the current number we are on, and the way we access the current number is by referring to the list of numbers and the particular index we are on. So if at any time this particular number we are on is greater than the user number, because that's what we're checking again, it said any number n, but we just called ours user number, is greater than the user number, Now, what do we want to do? We want to keep track of all these numbers that are greater than the user number. And so I'm going to create a list up here to store those values. And so this list will contain all greater than numbers. So let's call this greater than numbers. Greater than numbers. You can add a list. I like to add list to the end of it just so it's clear what it is. So greater than numbers list initially is going to be an empty list. Okay. And at any time, if we find that the particular number we are on is greater than the user number, then let's append that number to the list. We're keeping track of all those numbers greater than the user number. And so I'm going to refer to the list. I'm going to append to that list using the access operator, the dot operator, to access the append function of list, or that append method of list. And what are we appending to this list? It's going to be the particular number that is greater than the user number. This particular number here. This current number here. And then we keep going. So by the time this loop is done, this list here, which is greater than numbers list, will have all the numbers that are greater than the user number. And all what we do with it is return it. Return this list. Okay. All right. Since we're going to be asking the user to type in the number so we can search for in the list, then let's create a function for that as well. I'm going to call it get user number. So get user number. It's not really going to accept any argument. We're just going to ask the user for a number and return it. Sorry, I have this little cough here. So I'm going to call the input function and ask the user to please enter a number. So the input function is going to pop up this message to the user. It's going to allow the user to type in a value. Now, whatever the user types is going to be returned as a string. Well, in this case, we're going to kind of doing some math with it over here. We are, using a greater than sign, and so we need this value here as an int. By default, whatever the user types, the input function is going to return whatever the user types as a string. And when it's returning it, we need a place to store it. But we need that value also as an int. Let's assume that the list will contain, the list is going to contain integer values. And so I'm going to call the int function around whatever the user types. So the int function is going to convert whatever the user has typed, which was a string, or which is a string. It's going to convert it to an int and return it. And so when it's returning it, we need a place to store it. I'm going to create a variable to store that value. I'm going to call it user number. So user number is going to store whatever the input function is returning, converted to an int. And when we have that value, let's go ahead and return user number, return it. So return user number. And then now we have that function as well. The next thing I want us to create, the next function I want us to create is a function that is basically going to take a list, any list, and display the value stored in that list for us. So I'm going to create a function, define a function. I'm going to call it display. And actually, you can use this function anywhere else. Anytime you want to display the values in a list, you can use this function we're about to create. So display values in list, and if it's going to display the values in list, then we have to give it the list so it can display the values in it. So I'm going to define a parameter for a list. Whoever calls this function has to pass in a list. I'm going to call this parameter any list. All right, it can be any list, and we're just going to loop through it. Again, I like to use indexing to access values. Let's see here. But there are other ways to actually go through a list and display the values from it. Yeah. So if what you are doing is just displaying values, then I'm just thinking right now whether you should use the simple way or the other way, which gives you more control. I like to use indexing, but there are other simple ways. If you're just displaying values on the list, there are other easy ways to do that. I'm going to use indexing, okay, but you can use the other ways to display values in the list. So for current number, or let's call it current value, because it's the list can contain strings or anything like that. So for current value index in range, the range is going to be the length of the list. Sorry. The range is going to be the length of this list. And then we can go ahead and just display. We can print out the current value using the index. So again, if this list contains 10 items, then this will be 10. It's going to iterate 10 times, but it's going to assign the value 0 through to 9, all the way to, it's going to assign the value 0 to 9, while this loop is iterating. The first time it iterates, it's going to assign 0. Okay, and the second time it iterates, it's going to assign 1, all the way to 9. And then each time we are printing out, we're referring to the name of the list and the particular index. The first time is going to be 0, that's the first item in the list. Second time index is going to be 1, that's the second item in the list, and so on and so forth, all the way to the last item. If it's a 10, number list, or if it's a 10 value list, then the 10th item is going to have an index of 9. So just like I explained above. So this is a much more, I think it's a better way, because it gives you more control over the actual values. But you can use other ways to also display values in a list. Okay, so we have our function here, and now let's create our main function. So the main function in most programming languages is basically where your program starts. It's a function that calls every other function, so it's a good habit to have a main function. It's essential to create a main function that basically has your program. That's where your program starts, where program is. So the first thing we want to do is let's get the user number. Okay, let's get the user number. I'm going to call get user number. I'm going to call that function. Oops, I didn't mean to call it. We're supposed to define the main function. I'm going to define the main function here. Okay, so we're defining it. So we have our get user number function, which doesn't accept any argument. But this function, we know, returns the user number. And so when it's returning the user number, we need a place to store it. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it user number. It doesn't matter this variable name is the same as this variable name, the same as this. It doesn't matter. The scope of this variable is within the main function. The scope of this variable is within the get user number function. The scope of this variable is within the find or greater than numbers function. They are like twins. But they're different. They are considered different because they're in individual functions. They don't see each other at all.